Billionaire CEO calls black waitress stupid and lost $3.5 billion deal on the spot. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a luxurious evening at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the heart of San Francisco. The sky outside was dimming as the sun set behind the towering skyline, casting a warm glow on the glittering glass and steel of the building. Inside, the ambience was pristine, with chandeliers hanging like works of art and the hum of elegant conversations filling the air. At the center of the room, the table was a picture of wealth. Polished mahogany, golden accents, and wine glasses filled with the finest vintage. The guests, some of the most influential names in tech, sat confidently, discussing global mergers, market expansion, and billions in profits. But the most noticeable person at the table wasn't any of the men who dominated the conversation. It was Kamiko Hayashi, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, Hoshiko AI. She sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, her posture dignified but unyielding. Despite her silence, there was an undeniable aura of power that surrounded her. Her presence commanded respect, though the men around her seemed to ignore it. Derek Caldwell, the CEO of Valencer Biotech, took a long sip of his bourbon and chuckled as he leaned in towards his CFO, Trent Langley. "Do you think she even understands a word we're saying?" Derek whispered with a smirk. Trent snorted, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Probably not," he replied. "But hey, $1 billion buyout for a quiet sushi doll? I'll take that deal any day." The words hung in the air, thick with condescension. Kamiko didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply sipped her wine, the glass held steady in her hand. Her silence wasn't one of ignorance. It was a shield. The two men laughed, oblivious to the disdain in Kamiko's eyes, which flickered just for a moment. At the far end of the table, Naomi Brooks, a young black waitress, moved quietly between the guests, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, and adjusting silverware with the precision of a dancer. Her eyes, however, were far more attuned than anyone around her could ever imagine. She noticed everything. The way Derek's laughter was laced with superiority. The way Trent rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath. The subtle microaggressions that flew under the radar of the oblivious men, but not hers. Naomi heard the whispers. She saw the smirks. She was accustomed to being overlooked, to being ignored, but what she witnessed tonight went beyond casual disregard. It was blatant disrespect. It wasn't just Kamiko they were mocking. It was anyone who wasn't part of their exclusive world, anyone they considered beneath them. And Naomi was no stranger to being treated like that. The night seemed to stretch on as Derek and Trent continued to make light of Kamiko's silence, unaware of the power in her restraint. But Naomi was watching, and she knew something they didn't. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the most weight. The evening was building to a boiling point, and Naomi could feel it in her bones. What would happen next would change everything, not just for Kamiko, but for everyone at that table. The men thought they controlled the room, but Naomi was about to show them just how wrong they were. As the night continued, the tension at the table grew palpable. Derek and Trent's laughter echoed across the room, their voices loud, dismissive, and filled with the kind of arrogance that only comes from unchecked privilege. Kamiko, the CEO of Hoshiko AI, remained calm and composed. Her silence spoke volumes, but to Derek and Trent, it was a sign of weakness. They thought they had her pegged, a foreign woman, reserved, silent, someone who didn't quite belong in their world of power and influence. What they didn't realize was that this was exactly the mistake they would regret. Naomi stood near the back of the room, her hands steady as she cleared plates, but her mind was racing. She had witnessed enough to know how this would unfold. She had seen it before, the way powerful men assumed they were untouchable, the way they belittled others without a second thought. She was no stranger to this treatment herself. As a black woman in a job where people often looked down on her, she had learned to stay silent, to observe, to wait for the right moment. But this was different. Kamiko Hayashi wasn't just any woman. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Naomi could sense that beneath her calm exterior was a storm waiting to break free. Naomi's eyes flickered toward Kamiko, who had not spoken since she entered the room. She noticed how Kamiko's expression remained neutral, but the subtle tension in her jawline told a different story. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was control. As the men continued to dominate the conversation, Naomi couldn't help but feel a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. She knew Kamiko had her reasons for remaining silent, but Naomi was about to show these men what happens when you underestimate someone. She set her tray of empty glasses down on the bar and walked over to the table. She moved with purpose, her steps confident and deliberate. As she reached the table, Derek glanced up at her, his eyes filled with the same dismissive arrogance. "Hey, sweetheart, refill this for me, will you?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Naomi paused for a moment, her eyes locking with his. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but filled with an edge he wasn't prepared for. "Actually," she began, "I think it's time for you to listen, Derek." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the room went silent. Derek's smile faltered, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. He was used to being the one who controlled the conversation, the one who made the rules. But Naomi wasn't following his script. "What did you just say?" Derek asked, his tone rising slightly. Naomi didn't back down. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she replied calmly. "And that goes for Kamiko, too." The room seemed to hold its breath. No one knew what to say. The audacity of Naomi's words stunned everyone, including Kamiko, who glanced over at the young waitress. It wasn't just the words that shocked them, it was the way Naomi said them. With authority, with confidence. This wasn't the meek waitress they thought she was. This was someone who had been silently watching, waiting for the right moment to flip the script. Kamiko's eyes softened, a hint of approval flickering across her face. She had heard enough of Derek's arrogance, enough of his patronizing tone, and Naomi's words were the spark that ignited the fire. Derek, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. The power dynamics at the table had shifted in an instant. The men who had once believed they were in control were now on the back foot. Naomi wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an equal at the table, and she had just shown them the kind of power they had never considered. The power of silence, of observation, of knowing when to speak and when to act. Kamiko, who had remained quiet through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm, cutting through the tension in the air. "I think it's time we stopped talking and started listening," she said, her gaze locking with Derek's. The room went completely still. No one had expected that from her. Not a word, not a response to the constant jabs from the men around the table. But now, in this moment, Kamiko had made her move. And the game had changed. Naomi had set the stage, and Kamiko had just taken control. The balance of power was shifting, and the men at the table didn't know what hit them. For once, they were the ones who were silenced. The room was still, the weight of the silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. Derek Caldwell, the CEO of Valencer Biotech, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the confident grin he had been wearing just moments before now replaced with a hint of unease. He had never been spoken to like this, especially not by someone he considered beneath him, a waitress, no less. Naomi stood her ground, unwavering, her eyes locked on Derek's. The air was heavy with the tension of the moment, but it was also charged with something else, power. Naomi had just tipped the balance, and now, Kamiko Hayashi, the silent CEO who had observed it all, was stepping into the spotlight. Kamiko's voice broke the silence, and when she spoke, it was as if the entire room leaned in to listen. "I believe," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "It's time we make one thing clear. I don't need to sit at this table with men who believe they can speak over others, especially not when they clearly don't know who they're dealing with." The men at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances, the room once filled with confident chatter now quiet and uncertain. Kamiko's words, though measured, were like a sharp blade cutting through the pretensions of power. She wasn't angry. She wasn't raising her voice. She was simply stating a truth that they were all forced to reckon with. Naomi, standing beside Kamiko, could feel the shift. The power dynamic was no longer in favor of Derek and Trent. In fact, it was completely turned on its head. Derek had been so sure that he could steamroll Kamiko, dismissing her as just another silent foreign woman. Now, he was the one caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His attempt at regaining control had failed. The reality was, Kamiko wasn't playing their game anymore. She was rewriting the rules. You think you can mock people, Kamiko continued, her gaze now fixed on Derek. Because you hold money, because you hold influence, but that's where you're wrong. People like Naomi, she glanced at the young waitress, who was still standing tall beside her, are the ones who really hold power. The kind of power you can't buy, the kind that comes from knowing your worth, even when others can't see it. Derek's face turned a shade of red, his pride wounded, but his desire to maintain control didn't falter. He clenched his jaw and leaned forward, trying to assert himself, but Kamiko's calm presence only made his attempts feel more desperate. He finally managed to say, "You don't know what you're talking about." His voice, once full of confidence, was now laced with frustration. Kamiko raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she replied coolly. "And if you're smart, you'll start listening, because the world doesn't revolve around people like you anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew what to say. The energy in the room had completely shifted. It was no longer a dinner negotiation. It was a moment of reckoning. Naomi, who had been silently observing the exchange, now felt a quiet surge of pride. She had known all along that this moment would come. The moment when those who believed they could mock others for sport would be put in their place. And Kamiko had done just that. The men at the table sat back, their previous arrogance slipping away. There was no easy way out of this. The deal they had been so confident about, the one they had assumed would be in their pocket, was now hanging by a thread. But Kamiko wasn't finished yet. "You came here thinking you could make a deal with me," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But it's not going to happen. Not unless you learn some respect first." Naomi could see it now, the fear creeping into the eyes of Derek and Trent. They weren't afraid of losing a business deal anymore. They were afraid of losing control, of losing their position in the world they had spent their entire careers building. Kamiko's calm was her weapon, and she wielded it with precision. She wasn't just an observer in this world of power. She was about to change the game entirely. As Derek and Trent sat there, unsure of how to react, Naomi realized something. This wasn't just about one person's humiliation. This was about the world shifting, about the moment when power is no longer defined by wealth or status, but by the strength of character and the quiet resistance of those who have been underestimated for far too long. The silence lingered, and in that silence, everything had changed. The tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Derek and Trent exchanged uncomfortable glances, trying to salvage what little dignity they had left. But it was clear to everyone that they were losing control. Kamiko had already shown them that they were not the ones holding the power, and Naomi had made it impossible for them to ignore the gravity of the situation. The men at the table, who had walked in that evening as if the world was theirs to command, were now fumbling for words, grasping for any semblance of control they could hold on to. Kamiko, unfazed by the shift in dynamics, took a slow sip from her glass, her eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a dramatic gesture. Her presence alone commanded respect. The men were finally realizing that they had underestimated her, and worse, they had underestimated Naomi. Trent, who had been growing more agitated by the minute, leaned forward, trying to assert some sort of control. His voice was tight, almost strained. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You can't just walk in here and expect us to back down because of a few words." Naomi stood still, watching him. She had heard men like Trent talk down to others before, and it never failed to make her blood boil. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. She took a step forward, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. "You're right," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You don't have to back down." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But you do have to recognize when you're wrong. And right now you're wrong." There was a long silence, and for the first time that evening, the men were speechless. Naomi's words had landed with the precision of a well-aimed strike, and they had no response. Derek opened his mouth, but then closed it again, unsure of what to say. He had been caught off guard, and now the weight of the situation was starting to hit him. Kamiko, who had been silently observing the exchange, set her glass down gently on the table and stood up. She wasn't done yet. "Trent," she said, her voice cool but firm, "I think it's time we stop pretending this is just about business. It's about respect. And if you can't give respect to those who deserve it, then this deal isn't going anywhere." Derek, now visibly frustrated, shot a glance at Trent, but it was clear that he was out of his depth. Kamiko had turned the tables on them, and now they were the ones left trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. The dynamic that had once been so clearly in their favor was now crumbling. Kamiko's calm, her unwavering belief in her worth, had completely thrown them off balance. They were no longer in control. The room was still, the tension palpable, but Naomi could feel a shift, a change in the energy that had been present just moments before. For the first time that evening, she felt like she wasn't just a part of the background. She was an equal at the table, standing side by side with Kamiko, forcing the men to confront the reality of their actions. "I don't think you understand, Kamiko," Trent said, trying to regain his composure, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. "This is a business deal. It's about money. It's not about respect." Naomi's laugh, sharp and unexpectedly loud, cut through his words. "You really think this is just about money?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "You think that's all that matters? That you can buy your way through life and dismiss people like us when we stand up for ourselves?" She took a step closer to him, her voice lowering but still filled with conviction. "The deal isn't the most important thing here. It's about integrity. It's about knowing that you can't keep pushing people down just because you can. And that's why you're losing." The realization hit Derek and Trent harder than any of them could have expected. This wasn't just a business negotiation anymore. It was a reckoning. Kamiko had made it clear she wasn't going to play by their rules, and neither was Naomi. They were rewriting the terms, and Derek and Trent had no choice but to sit and watch as their carefully constructed world of power began to fall apart. The silence in the room was deafening. The once confident billionaires, who had come to the table with their usual arrogance, were now speechless. The power that they thought they held was slipping through their fingers, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Naomi glanced at Kamiko, a look of quiet understanding passing between them. In that moment, it wasn't just about the deal anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up, speaking out, and showing the world that no one, not even the wealthiest, could silence those who refused to be ignored. The room remained frozen in silence, as if the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air. Kamiko and Naomi had turned the table, shifting the power dynamic in a way that left Derek and Trent scrambling to regain any semblance of control. The billion-dollar deal they had hoped for now seemed like a distant memory, fading into irrelevance with every passing second. Naomi stood tall, unwavering, her words still echoing in the air. "The deal isn't the most important thing here. It's about integrity," she had said. And as those words settled into the space between them, it was clear that the men at the table had been shaken to their core. Derek, who had once carried himself with the arrogance of someone who thought he was untouchable, now looked uneasy. He had expected to dominate the conversation, to have Kamiko and Naomi bend to his will. But instead, it was the other way around. It was his turn to feel powerless. As the silence stretched on, Derek took a deep breath, as if trying to collect his thoughts, but the calm exterior he had carefully maintained throughout the evening was cracking. "You think you've won?" Derek's voice was shaky, his confidence faltering with each word. "This is just one deal. There will be others." But Naomi wasn't buying it. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes never leaving Derek's. "This isn't about winning or losing a deal," she said firmly. "This is about understanding that people like you can't just steamroll others because you have money or influence." Kamiko, who had been watching the exchange with quiet intensity, finally spoke again. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of someone who had seen this all before. "Derek, Trent," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You came here thinking that you could buy respect, buy power. But power is not something you can just purchase. Respect is earned, not bought." Trent, who had been fidgeting nervously in his seat, looked at Kamiko, his face red with frustration. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat, his voice thick with anger. "This is the world we live in. Money talks. People like you, people like her," he said, nodding toward Naomi. "They don't get to dictate the rules. Kamiko's gaze hardened, and she leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding. "The world you live in is changing," she replied, her voice low but strong. "People are waking up to the fact that money doesn't mean everything. And you," she paused, locking eyes with Trent, "are living in the past." For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the soft clinking of glasses from the nearby tables. The weight of Kamiko's words settled heavily in the air. Derek shifted in his seat, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger, but there was something else there now, a hint of fear. Fear that maybe Kamiko and Naomi were right. Fear that the world was shifting in a way that he couldn't control. Naomi watched them both closely, knowing that the game was now fully in their hands. They had pushed Derek and Trent to a point where they no longer had the upper hand. The power was in Kamiko's hands, and Naomi had helped take it back. She could feel the shift within herself as well. For so long, she had been just a waitress, invisible to the world that judged her by her appearance. But now, standing side by side with Kamiko, she was no longer invisible. She had a voice. She had power. And most importantly, she had the respect of the very people who had once looked down on her. "I think," Kamiko said, her voice cutting through the tension, "it's time for you to understand that the people you thought you could walk over, the ones you dismissed without a second thought, they're the ones who are changing the game." Derek and Trent had no response. They were stunned, speechless, their wealth and status no longer providing them the comfort it once did. The deal was lost. But it wasn't just the deal that had slipped through their fingers. It was the realization that the world had changed, and their place in it was no longer guaranteed. As Kamiko and Naomi stood together, their bond forged in the heat of the moment, the men at the table understood one thing. They had been outplayed, and there was nothing they could do to take back what had been lost. The silence in the room was deafening. Derek and Trent, once so sure of their place in the world, now sat in stunned disbelief, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They had walked into that room expecting to walk out with a deal worth billions, but instead, they had been confronted by the harsh reality that their power, their wealth, and their arrogance had failed them. Naomi stood tall, her hands steady at her sides, a quiet sense of victory settling over her. She hadn't expected this moment to feel so monumental, but now that it was here, she couldn't ignore the gravity of it. She had gone from being invisible in this world to standing in the light, commanding respect not only from Kamiko, but from everyone in the room. The room's energy had shifted completely. What had started as a power struggle between two wealthy CEOs and a silent woman had transformed into something entirely different. A lesson in humility, respect, and the undeniable strength of those who refuse to be ignored. Kamiko, too, was calm, almost serene in the face of the men's stunned reactions. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't raged, yet the impact of her words had been far more powerful than any outburst could have been. Her calm had become her strength, her silence had become her weapon, and she had turned the tables on these men without even breaking a sweat. She glanced at Naomi, her eyes meeting the young woman's with a sense of quiet approval. Naomi had been more than just a bystander. She had been part of this moment, had helped shift the tide, and Kamiko knew that without her, this victory might not have been possible. Derek finally broke the silence, his voice strained, as if trying to reclaim something he thought he still had control over. "You think this is over?" he spat, the arrogance in his words now tinged with desperation. "You think you can just take everything away from me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Kamiko's response was measured, unhurried. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, her voice as cool as ice. "And so do you. The difference is, I'm not afraid of you, and neither is Naomi." Derek's face reddened, his fists clenched at his sides. But even his rage seemed hollow now. The power he had once wielded like a weapon seemed almost laughable in the face of the quiet strength that Kamiko and Naomi had shown. Trent, his eyes flicking nervously between Kamiko and Naomi, cleared his throat, trying to regain some of his composure. "This isn't over. We'll go to court. We'll fight you," he muttered, his words lacking the conviction they once would have carried. Kamiko looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "If you think this is just about money and power, then you still don't get it. This isn't about winning or losing a deal. It's about understanding that people aren't things to be bought or sold. You can't put a price on respect, and you certainly can't buy integrity." Naomi stepped forward slightly, her voice steady. "You've been told all your life that money talks, that it makes the rules," she said. "But you've been ignoring one simple truth. Money isn't everything. And it never will be." The words hung in the air, and this time, it was Derek who couldn't respond. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The smug, all-powerful CEO who had once looked down on everyone else now seemed like a shadow of the man he had been when he entered the room. Kamiko smiled softly, the slightest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. She wasn't just winning the deal. She was winning something more important: respect. The power that Derek and Trent had clung to for so long was slipping away from them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "You've lost," Kamiko said quietly. "Not just the deal, but your place at the table. You thought you were in control, but you were never in control." "Not really." Naomi felt a strange sense of peace wash over her as she stood there, side by side with Kamiko. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the moment when she would no longer be invisible. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a force in her own right, and no one would ever be able to overlook her again. The room remained silent for a few moments longer, the realization of what had just happened settling into the minds of everyone present. Derek and Trent were defeated, their pride wounded, and no amount of money or power could fix it. For Kamiko and Naomi, however, this was just the beginning. They had shown the world that respect cannot be bought, and no one, no matter how powerful, could silence those who refused to be ignored. As the weight of the silence settled, the tension in the room was palpable. Derek and Trent, still reeling from the loss of their deal and the confrontation that had completely turned the tables, looked like they had been drained of their usual arrogance. The billion-dollar deal they had expected to walk away with now seemed irrelevant. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, respect, and the realization that they had failed to understand the true cost of their actions. Kamiko and Naomi stood side by side, the quiet strength they radiated now undeniable. Naomi felt the adrenaline slowly subside, replaced by a sense of calm. It was as if the storm had passed, leaving a strange peace in its wake. They had done what they came to do. They had shown Derek and Trent that there were forces more powerful than wealth, and it had been a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. The room remained still, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Derek, now fully aware of the shift, finally broke the silence. His voice was subdued, lacking the bravado that had once defined him. I didn't expect this," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I thought I had control, but I see now that I don't." Kamiko didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "Control isn't everything," she said calmly. "You never had control. You had power. Yes, but power is fleeting. Control is an illusion. True strength comes from within, from knowing who you are, and from respecting others, even when they don't seem to matter." Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze softening. She had seen Kamiko's strength up close and knew that what she said wasn't just empty words. Kamiko had lived it. She had fought for respect and earned it without needing to shout it from the rooftops. Naomi understood that now, perhaps better than anyone. Derek and Trent sat back, no longer the men who had entered the room with swagger and confidence, but two individuals who had been humbled by the realization that their wealth had not been enough to guarantee their success. "What happens now?" Trent asked, his voice weak. Kamiko looked at him, her eyes steady. "Now, you learn. You learn that respect is something you earn, not something you buy. And you learn that no matter how high you climb, you're never above the basic principles of decency and fairness." The truth in Kamiko's words cut through the room like a blade, and Derek shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the sting of his own arrogance, now fully exposed. Naomi, watching him, realized that this was the moment when everything had changed, not just for them, but for her as well. She had found her voice in the midst of their condescension, and Kamiko had shown her the power of quiet strength. Together, they had forced the world to listen. The room, still heavy with the aftershocks of the confrontation, began to feel smaller somehow. The grandness of the lavish dinner, the polished suits, the multi-million-dollar contracts, all of it seemed hollow in the face of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a defeat for Derek and Trent. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone who had ever used wealth and status to control others. Kamiko and Naomi had turned the tables, showing them that true power came from something far more enduring than money. Kamiko stood up, her presence commanding the room without a single word. She looked at Derek and Trent one last time, her voice soft but firm. "Take this lesson to heart," she said, "because next time, it won't be me you're dealing with. It'll be someone else. And if you don't change your ways, you'll keep losing. Because the world is changing. And so are we." With those final words, Kamiko turned and walked toward the door, Naomi following closely behind. As they left the room, the weight of the moment continued to hang in the air, and the men sat there in stunned silence, knowing they had just experienced something far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Kamiko and Naomi had not just changed the course of a deal, they had changed the game itself. As Kamiko and Naomi stepped out of the room, the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air, heavy yet liberating. The echoes of their words reverberated through the walls, and though they had left the scene, the power they had unleashed would not dissipate so easily. The world outside was just as chaotic, the city lights flickering as they walked toward the exit. But for Naomi, the air felt different tonight. It was as if the very streets beneath her feet held a new meaning. She was no longer the invisible waitress, no longer the one whose voice was drowned out by the noise of the world. Kamiko, walking beside her with a quiet confidence, was the reason for this transformation. Kamiko had shown her that there was power in standing firm, power in speaking up, and power in walking through the world with dignity. Naomi hadn't just witnessed a victory, she had been part of one. "How does it feel?" Kamiko asked softly, her gaze forward but knowing. Naomi paused for a moment, looking out at the bustling city ahead of them. It felt like she was seeing everything through a new lens, one that had been clouded for far too long. The streets, the lights, the people, all of it felt different. "It feels like I've been given a new life," Naomi replied, her voice steady but filled with a sense of wonder. Kamiko smiled, a small, knowing smile. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You've learned something tonight that most people never get to learn. The real power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from within, from the courage to speak your truth, even when the world doesn't want to hear it." Naomi nodded slowly, the weight of Kamiko's words settling into her heart. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood what it meant to own her worth. It wasn't something that could be bought or given. It was something she had always had, buried beneath years of silence and invisibility. As they continued to walk, Naomi thought back to the moments in the room with Derek and Trent. How easily they had dismissed her, how they had tried to push her and Kamiko into the background. It wasn't just the deal that had been lost. It was their sense of control, their false belief that they could dictate the course of everything. And now, it was their world that was crumbling, while she and Kamiko stood stronger than ever. But as Naomi's thoughts swirled, a part of her wondered what would come next. They had won, yes, but what would be the fallout? Would the men in that room, Derek and Trent, try to retaliate? Would they find ways to undermine Kamiko and her company? Kamiko, as if reading her mind, spoke again. "They'll try," she said calmly, "but their time is over. They've shown their true colors, and the world won't forget it. They can't play in the same game anymore. Not with the way we've changed the rules." Naomi smiled, feeling a sense of certainty that had been missing before. Kamiko was right. People like Derek and Trent, men who thought they could bend the world to their will, had underestimated not just Kamiko, but Naomi as well. The world was indeed changing, and Naomi was part of that change now. As they reached the door of the building, Naomi glanced back one last time at the lavish room they had just left behind. The clinking glasses, the suits, the luxury, it all seemed so far removed from the reality she now inhabited. A reality where respect, integrity, and courage were the true measures of power. "You're not just a waitress anymore," Kamiko said, her voice firm but kind. "You're a force, and the world will know your name." Naomi felt a surge of pride in her chest as they stepped out into the night. She wasn't just part of the world anymore. She was shaping it, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The city stretched out before them, full of possibilities, full of opportunities. And Naomi knew, deep down, that she was no longer invisible. The road ahead was hers to walk, and she would walk it with her head held high. Because this was just the beginning of her story, and it was a story that would never be silenced. The days that followed felt different, like the world had shifted on its axis, and Naomi had been given a front row seat to watch it happen. It wasn't just the victory over Derek and Trent that had changed her. It was the realization that everything she had ever dreamed of was within her reach now. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was in control. As the weeks went by, Naomi's life began to reflect that shift. She no longer walked into rooms hoping to blend into the background, to be unseen, unnoticed. She stood tall, commanding attention, not through loud words or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet confidence that had been born from the courage to stand up for herself and others. Her role at Kamiko's company began to grow, not because she was handed opportunities, but because she had proven herself time and again, showing that she was more than capable, more than just a waitress with a story. One evening, Kamiko called her into her office. The city lights shone through the large windows, casting a warm glow on the sleek, modern furnishings of the room. Kamiko was at her desk, looking every bit the powerful CEO she was. Yet there was something different in her demeanor that evening, a quiet pride, a knowing smile. "Naomi," Kamiko said, motioning for her to sit. "I've been watching you, and I think it's time for you to take on more responsibility here." Naomi's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She had seen herself as just a waitress once, just someone filling a role that no one else wanted to do. But now, she was being offered something more, something she had never dared to dream about. Kamiko continued, "You've shown me that you have what it takes to lead. Not because you have the title, but because you've earned it with your actions, your integrity, and your strength. It's time to move beyond what you've been doing." Naomi felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, I want you to take the lead on a new project," Kamiko said. "You'll be managing a team, overseeing some of our most important partnerships. It's a big responsibility, but I trust you." The words hit Naomi like a wave, overwhelming yet exhilarating. She had never imagined herself in a position like this, let alone with someone like Kamiko putting her faith in her. She nodded slowly, trying to contain the surge of emotions. "I won't let you down," Naomi said, the words coming from a place deep inside her, a place that had been quiet for far too long. Kamiko smiled, standing up from her desk. "I know you won't," she said. "You've already proven who you are. Now, the world is going to see it too." As Naomi left Kamiko's office, she couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a new chapter of her life. The weight she had carried for so long, the weight of being unseen, unheard, overlooked, had been lifted. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a leader, a force to be reckoned with. But as she walked down the hallway of the office building, Naomi remembered what had brought her here. It wasn't just the victory over Derek and Trent. It was the realization that the true measure of success was not the amount of money you had, but the strength of your character, the integrity you held on to when everything else was against you. She had learned that through Kamiko's example, and now she was ready to live it every single day. The world was changing, and Naomi knew she was going to be part of that change. She wasn't just going to watch from the sidelines. She was going to shape it. She was going to lead. And nothing, not even the people who had once underestimated her, would ever be able to take that away from her. As she stepped out into the night, the city before her glowing with opportunity, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She had won, not just the battle in the room, but the battle for her own future. And it was only just beginning. In this gripping narrative, we explore the powerful journey of a young Black woman who goes from being invisible to standing at the forefront of change. With her courage and determination, Naomi, a waitress, challenges the status quo and takes control of her own future, defying the expectations of the wealthy and powerful. In one of the most unforgettable Black stories, Naomi proves that true power comes not from wealth, but from integrity, strength, and the courage to speak up. As the story unfolds, we witness a dramatic shift in the power dynamics between Naomi and the influential CEOs who once looked down on her, demonstrating how a single moment can change everything. In these Black stories, the emphasis on respect and dignity over material wealth offers a refreshing perspective on success and the human spirit. Kamiko, a seasoned CEO, shows Naomi the importance of leadership and empowerment, guiding her to rise beyond her past and embrace her full potential. The transformation from a quiet, overlooked waitress to a confident, respected leader is a powerful message in Black stories. Naomi's journey is a testament to the resilience of individuals who refuse to be silenced, proving that anyone, regardless of background, can change their narrative and influence the world around them.